Okay, so welcome to the fourth team-based learning presentation, and we're going to be starting the digestive system. And with this presentation, we're going to look at the oral cavity down to the esophagus and how food enters the stomach through the esophagus. Okay, so as I always like to do, I like to kind of quantify the system that we're talking about. Okay, and so the gastrointestinal tract what we will be spending some time with over the next week or so here. And the way to think about the GI tract or the gastrointestinal tract is that this is one long tube, and it is literally a continuous tube all the way from the esophagus to the anus, and very similar layers all the way through and membranes. And one thing to note is that if something is inside the GI tract, it's considered outside of the body. Okay, and so I said a long tube, and it is long. It's about 30 feet long in the average size human. So a very long tube. And then one of the amazing things about the GI tract is the amount of surface area found in the GI tract. Okay, and so especially in the small intestine, we have lots of these little things here called villi and microvilli, and we'll look at those a little bit more in depth. Not this section, but the next section. All these different folds and outcroppings are places where blood vessels are found, and places where all these endocrine or enterocytes are there, the cells of the digestive tract that are there to digest and absorb nutrients. And so all of these little folds, if you count all the surface area on every little layer of these, and you put all that surface area into one area, we have about the size of a football field. So there's just a massive amount of surface area. And the key to remember with that is the more surface area we have, the more room we have for doing the business of the GI tract, which is absorption. Okay, and so the reason for the GI tract, why do we need the GI tract? Well, this is what provides nutrients for the structure of the body, the function of the body, energy creation, and all cellular processes of the body. This is where we get everything in. Okay, so the general processes of digestion are as follows. We have ingestion, mechanical digestion, and chemical digestion. Okay, so ingestion is literally just getting food into the body, and so this is obviously eating, or if we have other ways to get it in, like are shown there. And then we have from there, after we eat it, ingest it, we mechanically digest it, and that happens throughout the GI tract, but it starts in the mouth. And the function of this is to kind of break up the food and prepare it for more enzymatic digestion, make it more available for the enzymes to interact with. So this happens by chewing, by the tongue, smashing and mixing food around, by churning food in the stomach, and by segmentation, which we'll talk about what that is in a sec. And then we have chemical digestion. So this is the breakdown of food particles into smaller food particles that help prepare it to be absorbed. Okay, we have to get most food particles to their smallest components before we can absorb it. And this is mostly done by enzymes. So these enzymes include lipases, which break up lipids, zymogens, which are called proteolytic enzymes. These zymogens are the inactive form. So proteolytic means they break down proteins. And then all the amylases are there to digest sugars and saccharides, any of the carbohydrates. Okay, so you can see how each of those enzymes match up with one of the three macronutrients: lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Okay, so the processes of digestion are as follows. We have propulsion, absorption, and defecation. Okay, so propulsion is literally moving food through the digestive tract. Okay, so this starts with swallowing. And swallowing is also known as deglutition. And this is really moving the food from the mouth to the stomach. Okay, and then also a very important part of the GI tract as far as food movement goes is peristalsis. Peristalsis is you get smooth muscle contraction that occurs in waves, and so you can see the smooth muscle pinching and pushing this down. Okay, and it's moving that food down, and that's peristalsis, and this is how we move food through the GI tract. Okay, and then the next process of digestion is absorption. Okay, and this is how we get food from the GI tract into the blood or the lymph. Okay, and then finally we have defecation, which is elimination of the undigested or indigestible substances from the GI tract. And as I mentioned what segmentation is again. Segmentation is when you have these different segments kind of pinching off food and segmenting it, so you have it in these little different spots, and the food is moving down with peristalsis, and all of a sudden it pinches it off, and so that kind of churns the food up there, and then it pinches it off up here and pushes it back, and so it's kind of just moving the food back and forth, kind of alternatively, and mixing it up so it can all mix with the enzymes. Okay, so this is a figure from your book, figure 22.2, and what you need to do here is go to your book, open it up, and fill in the things that I don't have that are blank here, okay? And you'll need to know which processes are happening in which part of the GI tract, and that's what this shows, okay? So go ahead and fill those in from your book, figure 22.2. Okay, so then we have the multiple layers of the GI tract, okay? And so we're going to look at each of those layers, and the first layer is called the mucosa, okay? And the mucosa is the innermost layer, and then within the mucosa we have multiple layers, okay? So the most inner layer of the mucosa, which is the most inner layer of the three major layers, it'll make sense when you look at the picture here in a sec, but the most inner layer is simple columnar epithelial tissue, okay? You'll remember that. Those column-shaped single-layer cells, and most of the time this type of tissue has goblet cells, which are single cellular exocrine glands, right? They're secreting mucus, okay? So the functions of those are shown here: to dissolve digestive products, to activate them, and then also to protect the GI tract by secreting that mucus, protecting it from damaging chemicals coming into the body. Okay, and then also in this layer we have enteroendocrine cells, and these cells are scattered throughout, and what they do is they're kind of monitoring the type of contents that are going through the GI tract, and then based on the types of contents that are found, they release hormones that are going to be specifically driving some of the processes of digestion. So again, enteroendocrine, so part of the digestive tract, but endocrine cells, okay? And then the next layer, moving from the inside out, is the lamina propria. And this is loose areolar connective tissue with capillaries, and the function here is to help absorb nutrients and transport hormones because we have those capillaries. And then finally we have a very small, thin, muscular layer called the muscularis mucosae, and this is the function of this is to move food, to dislodge it when it gets stuck in this mucosal layer. Okay, next we have the submucosa, and the histology of this is it's dense irregular connective tissue. Okay, so this is next after the mucosa, moving out away from the inside part of the GI tract where the food will be going through. Okay, so this is many elastic fibers here, found here, and the function is to maintain shape of the GI tract after it gets stretched out when a big thing of food goes through there. Okay, we also find blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves in here. We have blood vessels because that's going to help with digestive products being brought to the rest of the body. Lymph vessels because that's going to bring how we bring lipids into the body, and nerves because this is how we control smooth muscle. And these nerves are part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and then we have the muscularis externa, which is the next layer out after the submucosa, and this is pretty much all smooth muscle. The most inner part is the circular fibers, the most outer part is longitudinal fibers, and then the stomach has an additional layer which is oblique, which is kind of a diagonally sectioned or diagonally angled fibers, and this is so we can squeeze down that food in all different directions and do different types of functions with it. Okay, the circular fibers will kind of cut off and segment the GI tract, whereas the longitudinal fibers are used to do peristalsis and push the food down linearly. Okay, and then we also find sphincters in this layer, so these are thickenings of smooth muscle. And the reason of that will be to completely close the GI tract in certain areas to prevent backflow, or also to slow down the movement of the food that's passing through. Okay, and then next external layer, the most external layer is the serosa, and this is all serous membrane. So just like the other ones around the heart and around the lungs, we also have a serous membrane around the GI tract, and so we find simple squamous epithelial tissue, and then also some connective tissue here. Okay, so again we have a visceral and a parietal layer of this. Visceral is closer to the GI tract, whereas parietal is going to actually be lining the abdominal cavity out further away from the inside of the GI tract. Okay, so this is mainly to protect and cut down on friction. Okay, and then this is where we find the mesentery, that nasty stuff you guys pulled out of the cats. This is where we find that. This is this folded double layer of this peritoneal cavity, peritoneal lining. And the function of this is to hold the organs in place and also provide some stability for the nerves and blood vessels that are passing through this area. Okay, so the digestive tract has a special blood supply, and so two different kind of parts of it here. You have what's called the splanchnic circulation, which is really the blood supply to the GI tract, and this can take about a quarter of the cardiac output while it's doing its work. Okay, and this can even increase a little bit higher during periods of major digestion. Okay, and so the functions of this circulation are to feed the cells of the GI tract. Obviously, they need a lot of nutrients to do all the work of digestion, but also we need the circulation there to absorb the nutrients and to bring those back to the body. And then this is where the hepatic portal circulation is. And we've talked about portal circulation before when we talked about the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. But the deal with this is any portal circulation system, you have two capillary beds, right? We talked about that before, so that's not the normal setup. Two different capillary beds. So this is really how we get blood flow to the liver. But the deal with this is you can see here, we have the first step is we have this capillary beds that are surrounding the GI tract and the small intestine, where most nutrients are absorbed. So nutrients flow from the small intestine into those capillary beds in the GI tract, and then they're going to travel towards the liver. Okay, so going from the small intestine, going towards the liver. Okay, and then they're going to go through a capillary bed where they can be filtered out of the blood into the liver, where the blood can be filtered and those nutrients can be taken out and dealt with by the liver, and then they go back into that capillary bed to be dumped back into the main circulation and back to the heart. Okay, so there's two separate capillary beds before it makes it back to the heart. That's a portal system. Okay, so then we also have a specialized nervous system in the GI tract called the enteric and nervous system. And this is unique because it's not controlled by the central nervous system. It's somewhat similar to the parasympathetic nervous system, but this is considered part of the autonomic nervous system. And the functions of this are really just to coordinate the activity of digestion of the GI tract, and so to make sure the pace of the movement of food is good, and so this is what's helping contract all those smooth muscles and move the food along. Okay, and you don't need to know the names. You don't need to know all the stuff on this figure over here. You just need to know this stuff written over here. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit at the cavities that the food goes through, starting from the mouth down through the esophagus. Okay, so the oral cavity, we've already looked at most of these structures already in the previous slides. We talked about the respiratory tract. So what you can do here is just look at these structures here and label where they would be found here. One thing to note, a couple things to note: this is obviously the hard palate. This is the soft palate. Okay, we have this big tongue here, and you can see there's extrinsic muscles of the tongue which originate on the bones of the skull and the jaw here, and then we have intrinsic muscles that are up here. They originate within the tongue. Okay, and the extrinsic muscles act to move the tongue, whereas the intrinsic muscles act to change the shape of the tongue. Okay, and so you should just be able to label these different structures here from figure 22.7. Okay, now we have some very important salivary glands. Okay, and the salivary glands are really glands with ducts that open up into the mouth. Okay, so these little glands that I have circled here, you don't need to know the different names of them. You just need to know they're here and they're dumping substances into the mouth. Okay, and within these glands, there's two different cell types. There's the serous cells, which produce a watery secretion that contains enzymes for breaking down food, and then the mucus cells, which contain or releases thick, stringy mucus that does not have enzymes. Okay, and so the secretions are pretty much going to be continuous. We're always releasing fluid from these salivary glands, and it's a pretty amazing amount. It's about 1 liter to 1.5 liters of fluid a day that's coming out of these, and so this is all going down the GI tract and out the body. So we can lose quite a bit of fluid through our salivary glands. And one thing that's important to understand here is that the difference between parasympathetic control and sympathetic control of these salivary glands. Okay, so Parasympathetic activation leads to thin, watery secretion, so this directly stimulates the serous cells here. Okay, so facial nerve 7, or cranial nerve 7, which is facial nerve, and glossopharyngeal cranial nerve 9 stimulates the serous cells, and this is going to be to aid in digestion. So parasympathetic nervous system controls digestion, right? If we have sympathetic activation, we're going to stimulate those mucus cells instead and get this thick mucus-like secretion. And the function of that is to decrease fluid loss. If we're stressed out, then we want to hold on to fluid. That's the function of that. Okay, so then the teeth are part of the oral cavity, I'm not going to go through this too much, but I do want you to know the different layers here of the teeth and be able to layer that. So there's the different there's the tooth structure and the different levels: the crown, the neck, and the root. Next slide. What we'll see here is the tooth itself, and you guys can go to figure 2211 to label the different layers and those different structures there shown in the figure. Okay, so then now moving out of the oral cavity into the esophagus. So the esophagus is really what's connecting the laryngopharynx to the stomach. Okay, after we move past the pharynx, that lowest level of the pharynx, to the stomach. Okay, it can completely collapse when it's empty, which is kind of interesting. And we have this, it's a very muscular organ, just this muscular tube, and it has 3 different sections to it. Okay, so the upper 1/3, the part that's closest to the mouth, is all striated / voluntary muscle. We can control that. Okay, the middle 1/3 is about half striated, half smooth muscle, so we can kind of control it, but not completely. Part of it is involuntary. And then the lower 1/3 is all smooth muscle, meaning that contraction of that lower 1/3 of the esophagus is completely involuntary. That's what answers what does this mean. Okay. One clinical application here, as I mentioned before, the esophagus goes right through the diaphragm, as it's shown here. So you have the diaphragm coming here. In order to get down to the stomach, we've got to pass through the respiratory, through the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity. Okay, so it's got to poke through the esophagus here. One of the problems with this is this hole is called the esophageal hiatus, and one of the problems with this is called a hiatal hernia. Okay, and so with the hiatal hernia, the stomach actually pushes up through that hiatus, and then you get this opening up here, and some of the stomach is actually found in the thoracic cavity, and this leads to major GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, because the diaphragm was kind of helping out the sphincter that's there. And I'll show you where that sphincter is in a sec. That sphincter is called the gastroesophageal sphincter, or they're also called the cardiac sphincter. And you'll see there that's about where it's found, and so that's right where the diaphragm should go. And that by the diaphragm squeezing down, that helps that helps out the function of that sphincter and keeping food from going back up into the esophagus, which is reflux disease. And so with that different alignment, you get a lot more GERD. And this is that sphincter's job is to prevent backflow. Okay, so finishing up here, starting with actually digestion. Okay, the first part of a digestion starts in the mouth. Okay, so we get some mechanical digestion. Obviously, the chewing of food is very important because it breaks up the food, makes more of it available to interact with the enzymes. And then we also have some chemical digestion that happens here too. So we get parasympathetic nervous system activation of the salivary glands. So we stimulate those serous cells that secretes the thin watery secretion, which contains an enzyme called salivary amylase. Okay, if you go back to the beginning of these slides, you'll see that all the amylases are there to break down carbohydrates. So that's what salivary amylase does. We partially start breaking down carbohydrates. Okay, and this is important to know. This is where chemical digestion starts, and you can kind of do this by putting something like a piece of bread or a cracker or something that's a polysaccharide into your mouth and just let it sit there. After you chew it up a little bit, you'll notice it starts getting sweet, and that's because it goes from being a polysaccharide down to at least to a disaccharide, sometimes to a monosaccharide, not quite to a monosaccharide yet, but maybe down to disaccharide, which is sugar and can taste sweet. Okay, and then the process of swallowing is what we'll finish with here, and there's kind of there's some voluntary portions of this as well as some involuntary portions of this. So early on, what we're going to do is form the food into a bolus by chewing it, smashing around with our tongue, and then we move it down into the pharynx by the tongue. And then this pharyngeal phase is moving the bolus down through the pharynx, okay, and then down into the esophagus, and then we get the peristaltic contractions that are moving the bolus all the way down past the gastroesophageal sphincter into the stomach. Okay, and this slide really clearly outlines what's going on here, and I'll go through it a little bit here, but I want you guys to study this and know this process. So as you can see, the bolus is this green here. It gets chewed up into the mouth, and then what happens? What you see here is this sphincter here is closed. This esophageal sphincter is closed, so nothing's going to go through there right now. So we're chewing it up, turning it into a bolus, and then starting to move it back into the oropharynx. Okay, and so phase 2 is the tongue comes up, smashes the food, pushes it back. Also, the uvula moves up, blocks this nasopharynx, so the food can't go up into the nose. And then, and then also the trachea moves up. Okay, the larynx moves up, and then the epiglottis moves down. So we're blocking the respiratory pathway, and so the food does not go up into the nose, doesn't go down into the trachea or into the larynx, and goes straight down the esophagus. Okay, and then that esophageal sphincter must open up or relax in order to allow that to go through. Okay, once that passes past the esophageal sphincter can contract again and close that off, and now the bolus is moving down, and so we have smooth muscle contraction of this and some actual voluntary contraction moving the bolus down. And then once we get down into the esophagus, again, peristaltic contractions moving the bolus down, moving it down, and then again we need the sphincter here to open. Okay, so we get the gastroesophageal sphincter opening by relaxation of that sphincter. That allows it to pass through, and like it says here, gastroesophageal sphincter opening, and then that opens up and gets it into the stomach, and now food is into the stomach. And we'll pick up next time after the food gets in. Okay, and then just lastly, this is what I want you to know from that last slide. Okay, and I want you to write this out and be able to kind of write out this process before you come to class for the TBL day. Outline the steps of swallowing all the way from the mouth to the stomach. And so in each step, know where the bolus is, what action is being taken to move the bolus, what other actions are being taken to make sure the bolus goes the right direction, mainly up when we are in the mouth and by the larynx, and then which muscles, structures, and sphincters are involved in each step. Okay, so you'll want to be able to kind of work that out before you come into class for the TBL day. All right, guys, that'll do it.